Welcome everyone to this Planning Commission. The date is Monday, August 11th. Will everyone please rise for Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. The first item of tonight's agenda is the actual approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes they'd like to make? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, move to approve tonight's agenda.
Second.
A motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Moving on, we have the approval for the minutes for the July 28th, 2014 meeting. Does anyone have any changes that they'd like to make to those meeting notes?
Mr. Chairman, move to approve the minutes for the July 28th, 2014 planning meeting.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed at all? Or any abstentions?
I abstain.
Okay. All right. Looks like we're going right down to planners reports. There are no public hearings tonight. Julie, do you want to take us through and kind of get us up to speed on the planners report for tonight, please?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
HKGI is the project consultant on the city's draft TOD ordinance that we're working on compiling. We are working on this project as a part of a grant that the city received from the Met Council, and we need to show continual progress and have a document that will be ready by the end of the year, or at least the consultant has finished their work on by the end of the year. So this evening is not a public hearing. It is simply a draft that is available for your viewing. HKGI will walk you through the overall draft and then identify a handful of issues that they are looking for specific comment on to get your feedback prior to a more formal draft coming forward to you later.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Regina, do you have anything to add to that at all? I see you sitting over there, so just wondering from a city staff perspective.
I'm here for support and to answer any questions that you might have through Brad's presentation.
Perfect. Brad, do you want to take us through it then?
I will do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. My name is Brad Scheib. I'm a Vice President and a Principal Planner with Hoyzington Kogler Group. And as Julie introduced, we are here to lead you through this ordinance process. What you have in your packet is what I would say is a first draft. I would say a very rough first draft. It's one that has pulled together all of the input that we've received thus far and incorporated a lot of the discussions that we've had with staff getting to this point. What I'd like to do today is present some of the key features to you and then let you pose questions back to us for clarification purposes. I'd like to seek a little bit of guidance on a few items. And really, I like to say this is collaboration. This is an opportunity for me to work with you. You guys know the community better than I do. And you have the ability to look at these and say, here's what it means to Eden Prairie, whereas I'm bringing it more from a higher level technical process. So I'd like to just kind of walk through the ordinance with you. I'm going to start just by throwing this slide up there and talk through some of the key things here. There's 13 different sections of the ordinance. We call them subdivisions. Starts out with purpose. We talk about applicability. Where does it go? Where do we apply it? Some key definitions. We talk about sub-districts, because right now we're talking about TOD at a high level, but there are a variety of different districts that will fit within a TOD ordinance. How do we deal with non-conforming uses and structures? That's a pretty standard one for ordinances. Some required conditions. A use table. What are the land uses that we might apply? Building types. Building types is something that is in the town center ordinance, which I'll talk more about. I know not all of you were here during that process. But building types is an important thing, and it's a little bit different than the traditional ordinance. Bulk and dimension standards, your setbacks, your heights, etc. Building orientation and design, how does it address the street? Where does parking go? How much parking do we need to have? Pedestrian and bicycle facilities, that's not often in a traditional ordinance. That's another unique piece to a TOD ordinance. And landscape and open space standards. So those are the 13 subdivisions, if you will, that we have right now. As we work through this, I anticipate that we will shrink that number of subdivisions down because a lot of these are covered through other areas within the ordinance. And so some of these may not be necessary. We have them in there right now, primarily so we don't forget them, but also to make sure that we cover all the different topics that we need to in the ordinance. there may be as well some new subdivisions that come out of this based on some comment and feedback we get. Last month, I think it was last month, we did a visual preference survey with you all, and we went through a number of photographs in a number of different categories. We've taken that summary, and I'm not, oh boy, it worked when I started. Now it's not. Let me see if I can do this. We've summarized that visual preference survey, and I'm not going to go through all this with you because we still have 61 slides. We went through like 150 in our last meeting, if you recall. So we have, that's my problem. We have 51 slides here, or 61 slides here that summarize the key information that we received as we went through that visual preference survey. You know, we look at what are the things that people talked about that they liked. People liked mixed use. They liked shopping and retail, that activity at the street level. They liked architecturally interesting buildings, but you'll see later a slide that says we don't like things that are too busy. So there's a clutter concern, but there's also this architecturally interesting intrigue. We like tall. We liked more often the urban center component. And then we pulled some of the buildings that people liked the most that they ranked. And looks like my slideshow is going to get messed up here because of my flash drive. In any sense, we took that information and we've incorporated it into the ordinance. If you want to see all of that summary, you can get a hold of Regina. She can give you that whole slideshow summary, and you can go through it at your own time. I'm not going to go through it in detail now. All right. So I just wanted to make sure you all know that that was helpful information. You guys gave us a lot of good stuff on that. Discussion points and key topics for today. I will say that as we get into the ordinance, interject at any time with a question or a concern or a comment as we go through this. I'm going to try to keep us as a total meeting to not more than an hour and a half. That's my general rule. But feel free to interject as we move through, and I'll make sure we keep moving. One thing I want everybody to think about, when we talk about TOD and staff, and I know we as consultants have also had this problem from time to time, we're trying to create an ordinance that's really specific to transit, specifically transit operations and station areas. So when we start talking about things that are good policy that really apply everywhere in the city, we don't need to incorporate all of that into this ordinance. For example, sustainability standards. There's no reason why sustainability standards aren't just as important in an industrial park as they are in a TOD station area. So we don't necessarily need to wrap sustainability standards into a TOD station area. If we don't have them as a general policy in the city, that's something that we need to talk about in a different agenda, but something that might apply to the TOD station area, and maybe they apply differently than they do to an industrial park. But I want just to keep this statement in mind. What are those things that are specific to transit station areas versus good policy that should apply across other areas of the city and not just transit? So now let's see if this works. Yay, it did. Okay. Did not work. Let me try a different way. Okay, this is the one I want. So I'm going to walk just through each section with you. And as I mentioned, feel free to interject at any time. The first section is the purpose. Why do we have this? And I highlighted some things here that are the most important element of this purpose statement. There's a little bit of purpose statement creep in here, as I would call it. I think all of these are important, but again, that question about what's important to TOD versus what's important to general city policy. Things important to TOD, the reason we do this. One, we want to promote higher density development within convenient walking distance to a transit station. We want to maximize the opportunity for development and clear the path to entitlement to be able to let the marketplace do that adjacent to station areas. We want a complementary mix of market-supportive land uses. In any transit station, ideally, we have a mix of uses. We don't necessarily have just one, but there might be cases where we do have a focus on one particular land use, knowing that each station might have a different theme or identity. You have that here in Eden Prairie. We want it to be oriented to public spaces, particularly the transit station. Not just any public space, but if your development is close to the transit station, think about how it faces or orients, or there's a public plaza component that emphasizes or pays particular attention to the transit environment. We want it to connect to the LRT station. We want to incorporate civic amenities. We want to make sure that it's a great place for people to be, not just to pick up the train and ride somewhere, but it's a comfortable environment. It's a safe place, safe transit station area environments, particularly where you've got a lot of people in the pedestrian realm. And a lot of that is really meant not to be that we have police on the ground, but that we think about design in ways that doesn't create opportunities or doesn't enhance opportunities for deviant behavior. We want something that promotes or enhances streetscape environment at the level of the pedestrian, the bicycle, and the transit rider. So all of these things are the key purpose statements. When we get into talking about specific numbers, dimensions, uses, we always want to think back, well, how does that further this purpose? Does it? If it doesn't, maybe it doesn't belong in here. Okay? Applicability. This is the section. Well, first I should just ask, are there any questions on the purpose statements? Yes.
Just one question. Beyond on and off boarding from the trains themselves, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, are we hoping to attract people to linger and, as an example, spend discretionary dollars around the stations? I mean, is that kind of an underlying principle? So there needs to be some kind of, whether it be commercial or non-commercial, attractiveness that accommodates that sort of idea?
I would say that's a desired consequence. Especially if you have a commercial district, sometimes you'll see station area planning, the public plaza right around a transit station. They'll make that more than just that place for onboard, offboard, and for purchasing tickets, but they'll make it more of a celebration area. You look at the intermodal station in downtown next to Target Center. That's to the extreme. So the idea of making it a gathering place is something that's there. I don't know that the ordinance is the right tool to do that, but to certainly create environments where it can happen. And so we talk about incorporate civic amenities, for example. That's part of that purpose. But that's a good point, Steve. Let's move on. Let's talk about applicability.
As a question, please.
Yeah.
Just a couple nitpicks. Complementary, I think, should be an E, as it is in B.
Sure.
And also the first paragraph, it looks like it needs to just be justified.
Yes. Very rough draft. Thank you. There's actually a lot more formatting that we do need to clean up. One of the things of which my version of this is much more user-friendly than yours if you're looking at it electronically, but we'll add some bookmarks and things that helps you navigate through it. Okay, so let's talk about applicability. So right now, the line is still in its planning and design phase. It hasn't been approved at the federal level yet. So it's hard for us to go out and establish this TOD ordinance tomorrow. So we need to wait until we see that mature more before we actually apply the ordinance. But we're still thinking at a level of what are the guidelines for where the districts do apply. So at this point in time, we're focusing on that 10-minute walk shed. And this is the mapping that was done as part of the Transitional Stationary Action Plans, the TSAP plans, that looks at this 10-minute walk shed, which the lighter color is that current 10-minute walk shed. The yellow color is once some of the improvements are made in terms of street connections or trail connections. That becomes all of that 10-minute walk shed. So when we think about the TOD districts, this is the general area that we would look to apply it. That doesn't mean we can't apply it further, but it means when we look beyond that 10-minute walk shed, that application is more discretionary. So if you think about each station area, of course it's not going to work. You think about each station area, that's kind of the thought process between how we would apply it. Okay. I'm going to move on. One of the things I'll come back to at the end is talk more about the town center zoning district and talk about that particular walk shed in that district. Let me move on to definitions. And again, interject at any time if you have questions. Definitions is one section that we're talking about now, whether or not we want to have it specifically in the Eden Prairie TOD zoning district, or do we take some of these definitions that aren't in your current full zoning ordinance and incorporate those into that zoning ordinance. That way we're not having separate definitions that have the potential to conflict. So I would imagine that ultimately we'll take this out and we'll put it into the full zoning ordinance. I just highlighted a couple that are important. Some of these came right out of that town center process. One is the building break, and that is just simply saying if you've got a long wall, we need to have some kind of break in the articulation of that long wall. Pretty simple, supported by the visual preference survey stuff that we did. Building step back is more vertical. So some of the pictures that you really liked were the ones that went up 2 stories or 3 stories, and then the remainder, which 4 or 5 stories more, was step back. So we've got some provisions in there for that building step back. We've added some about bicycle parking and define what is long-term bicycle parking, more substantial capital investment, versus short-term biking, which is more simply your bike stalls. Some of it may be even movable. Other than those, most of the definitions in here are pulled from other sections in your zoning code and pretty common. As we move through this, if there are other definitions that come up, feel free to throw those out, and we'll simply add those as we move along in the process. So that brings us to sub-districts. We have 5 different station areas in Eden Prairie, each rather distinctly different. We have looked at those, and we've come up with an approach very similar to what was done again in the town center area, but in this particular case, we've said we've got 3 different types of TOD districts. One TOD district is the mixed-use district. That's the one that is the greatest density in terms of scale and mass, that's closest to the transit station, and that might have the most diversity of uses that are integrated into it. We say that we want to have, and the last statement in here, this targeted mix of uses, it's intentionally phrased that way. It's not phrased as you have to have 20%, but it says we're trying to achieve this. So there's a little bit of leverage in there when you get into the site plan review process. You're trying to achieve this character, and in the mixed-use district, we want the street that's that transit-oriented street, the street that's leading right up to the station, to have that retail service orientation. You might have office above it. You might have residential above it. It can be totally mixed use. You might have a hotel. But we want at least to have a 20% retail service percentage in that mixed use area. The mixed use area is also probably going to be the smallest and most compact zone. It's not intended to be this big area. It's meant to be right near the station, 2, maybe 3 blocks around that transit station. The next one that we have in here is the TODR. This is the residential district. So you think of an area that's predominantly housing, higher density still, multi-story stacked housing. We may have a percentage of it that is that retail service. Again, if you've got a high density of housing, you might have a coffee shop, you might have a convenience store, some small scale restaurants. So you could have that mixed into there. So it's still a mixed use, but it's predominantly a residential district. The last one is the employment area. This is the flip side of that. It's predominantly employment. You can think of the golden triangle on this one. On this one, we said we still want a greater density, but this is probably going to be the least dense environment because of you might have more single-story box manufacturing industry type uses. We've said in this one we still also want some kind of retail services, 5%. Really small amount, but it might be the corner sandwich shop or the corner coffee shop or the corner print shop that's providing a service to the job environment that's there. So those are the 3 districts we've applied. The task will be, once the station areas are approved and we know that that's coming and it's a done deal, the task will be then applying those districts according to that 10-minute walk shed, and again, that little bit of discretion that's involved. I would welcome any comments on thoughts on those particular districts, the mix of use, the general intent behind any of those. Any questions you have?
Yeah, I got a quick question. When it came to the achieved percentage ratio, what was the criteria that you came to the 80-20, 60-40? How did you come to that specific number as opposed to any other?
We did a little bit of site testing, and so we thought how big is a couple of block area if we took a 330 by 330 foot block and said 80% of that's residential, how much of that would be retail if it's 20% ground floor? And we thought about total square footage, and I want to say in the mixed use areas we were 20 to 50,000 square feet total. So you think about a couple of restaurants, maybe a convenience store, maybe a dry cleaner, and that's what you're going to have. It's not meant to be this big footprint of retail services. So we did a little bit of site testing, and that's how we arrived at it. The TODR was a little more challenging because it could be a bigger district. So there you might have, at the edges of that, you might literally have a strip mall kind of environment that's on the ground floor of a building that might be closer to 100,000 square feet of retail. So we did a little bit of site testing to arrive at it. It wasn't just pulled out of the air. Yep.
And is that standard, that site testing?
Yes. In fact, we're continuing to do it now.
Okay.
And when I said this is a very rough draft, when we get into the bulk standards, you'll see I'm already going to mention some numbers that we've realized should be different, just based on testing that we did today.
Okay.
And one of the next steps will be actually showing those illustrations.
Okay.
They weren't quite ready today yet.
Stephen, did you have a follow-up question? I thought you were...
Oh, I just had one. I like the way this flows, but I was just curious, what's the thinking behind the various levels of density? So you're starting with a higher density and then you're grading it down basically, or you're going to lower and lower levels of density as we move away. I like the sound of that, but was just curious about the logic behind that. Does that have something to do with people lingering in the area, or where does that come from?
No, it's more maximizing the value of that land around the transit station with greater density. That's predominantly it. And you'll see when we get later into this, we start talking about minimum densities and no maximums.
Yeah. And just pushing that a little further, why do you want to maximize the value there versus other tracts of land in the city?
Well, I think you want to maximize the value of land everywhere in the city.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of what got me to that.
Yeah. Here we're emphasizing it because there's a major public investment in the transit infrastructure.
I see. Okay.
But that's a good point. I mean, there's no reason why we wouldn't want to try to maximize it. But there's some places where that greater density is just not as important as it is in this environment.
So it's almost a return on investment.
It is, very much so. Very much so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And we'll continue to talk more about those particular districts. In fact, one of the things, let me just jump ahead here. This slide right here, these are the kinds of illustrations we're working on right now. These are more stock, so they're not specific to Eden Prairie. But at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is we want to put up one illustration, knowing that there could be many, of each of those districts. But it gives you sort of a mass scale character idea. It's not meant to be specific to, if you look at any of these and go look on the ground out there, you're not going to find it. But it's meant to give you, an idea of height, meant to give you an idea of block scale. So we're working on some of these graphics, and what we're doing is testing the setback requirements and the bulk standards that we've established. And we're finding we're going to have to tweak those a little bit to get the right scale. But this is the kind of imagery that we hope to insert into the ordinance. Okay, I'm going to breeze past some of these. So non-conforming uses and structures. The city already has a lot of language in their regular zoning ordinance about how do you deal with, once we apply this, we may create some circumstances where they're non-conforming. They can still, if their building burns down, they can rebuild under certain conditions, or if they're looking at transferring the property, they can transfer the property, but there's certain restrictions. So I know I need to tweak about a lot of this. This was stuff that we put in kind of last minute based on some other TOD precedents that says we still may allow certain improvements. Let's say someone wants to do a facade improvement. That may be okay. But I think the key message is that once we apply this, we don't want to promote or encourage or allow development that's going to move us backwards. So, for example, there may be a building out there that's a small retail building, and they may want to put a drive-through on, and it's a block away from the transit station. We may not want to encourage that. We may not want to allow that because that furthers us from ultimately realizing that bigger picture. What we can do, and what I would encourage you to think about, over the next week or so, is what kind of things might we want to accept from that, and we can build in some exceptions to this. And so the first, we have a few bullet points here, and I don't think they totally get at it right, but the idea is to build in some of those exceptions for this TOD area. So that's one section that we'll work on as we move forward. It's not totally thought out now. I wanted to get something in there and not just leave it blank. Required conditions. This section here has a lot of references to other sections of the code. And I think this is one place where that principle that I laid out at the beginning applies. Is this something specific to transit, or is it more of a citywide policy? So a lot of these tie back to the existing city codes. We ultimately may remove a lot of those because they're there already. But just so you know, we are making sure that other sections of the code still apply to this district, performance standard-wise. The ones I highlighted in yellow, you do a lot of this already. It's not necessarily written into any specific zoning code. So we wrote it into the zoning code in this one. So it's not a question of, well, we need to apply this policy. It's, you got to apply this policy. So one of them is this trip generation analysis. One of the things you'll see that we've done is we've taken out the cap on density in a lot of these places. We said, go high as the market, we'll support it. But we need to make sure that anybody that does do that is also cognizant of the impact on the infrastructure, because they have to be able to make sure that it works and that it doesn't make the rest of the district not work. So this trip generation analysis is a key component of that. And the next segment, the TDM plan, the travel demand management plan, is a component of that. If you're willing to go higher, you have to be able to bear the burden of making sure the infrastructure works. And so that TDM strategy is written in there. That's language that comes straight from how you currently apply the TDM strategy. So we just wrote those into the zoning code. And there may be other things that we ultimately add into this section in that vein. Same thing goes for sewer and water infrastructure systems. If you all of a sudden expand a building super dense because the market will do it, we have to make sure that stormwater systems are there, sanitary sewers there, and public water supply. So there may be just an infrastructure impact analysis. The comment I have in here that we need to investigate, part of this testing, and we'll work with Don, I think I saw, yeah, he's Don. Is there a certain trigger in how high you go or how dense you go that pushes us to that point where we really need to do that extra testing? Or do we need to do it all across the board for everything? We're still working on trying to answer that question. So that's this required conditions thing. If there are other things that you think of that you'd like to see required, again, that are applicable to that transit station area, that's where this stuff would go. The next thing is the use standards, the use table. In this particular case, we have the 3 districts across the top and a listing of uses along the side here, broken into commercial uses, more employment or industrial type uses, residential uses, and then we have a mixed use category. A couple things I want to just raise and point out. One, I need to add to the TODR district neighborhood commercial. That neighborhood commercial is that small scale retail. We just left that out. The question I'd like to hear you all talk about is we've maintained as a permitted use in this TODE district. And again, if you think back, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to maximize the density of employment activities. We've left in there for the purpose of conversation tonight, warehousing, wholesale, and distribution. And if you think about those types of uses, you're not exactly generating a lot of employment density. We're also not necessarily generating a lot of value. So my question is, do those belong as permitted uses? Do people have any heartache if we said, you know what, those uses don't belong in the TODE district? The only place where that would run into some issues, I think, is in the Golden Triangle. If we were to apply this, there might be some of those uses that are in there. The other way to think about it is in the Golden Triangle near this transit station. If, let's just say FedEx or UPS or one of the big distributors said, we want to put a world-class 600,000 square foot distribution center that's going to generate one employee per 5,000 square feet. And we want to put it right there close to that transit station. I don't know if they ever would. But if they did, would you accept it? Would you want it? So that's a good question, and I think an important question, because the Golden Triangle is an area where we have to be careful about how we apply this, because it's a pretty popular industrial or that type of use environment. So something to think about. Otherwise, the uses in here I think are all pretty consistent. Questions?
So maybe just building on that whole thought, if we go back to the idea that one thing, among others, that we're trying to get done is to get the traveling public to become engaged in those transit station areas. And the way you're going to have to do that is to have, quote unquote, attractive facilities of varying kinds around those stations. The kind of facilities that you just talked about, the distribution type facilities, would seem to not play that kind of role. And therefore my question is, are we not talking about those attractive things, in quotes, that would get people engaged, being those that are closest to the stations themselves geographically, so that they're accessible, and then as you move out in spheres, you may drop the importance of that objective, and therefore more passive structures could find a place, because for the city overall, they do have a return, whether tax base or whatever, but they don't address that attractiveness, engagement issue around the stations. So would that say that there is I don't know how to put it, but the closer you are to the stations, the smaller number of passive types of development you're going to want, because they don't serve that need to get the public engaged. Is there a criteria in there somewhere that follows that kind of line, or am I off base on that?
No, I think you are. I mean, if you look at practice, the way we've described this, the MU district is closest to the station. The employment residential districts are further away. So if that were the case, this employment district might be further out than right at the core. And so maybe those uses are fine in that employment district.
So as an example from your experience, and this is, I'm sure, something you'd almost have to make up, but from your experience, from station outbound, how close do these various facilities that are going to engage the people have to be?
5-10 minute walk.
5-10 minute walk?
Yeah.
So an initial criteria might be, assuming anyone even agrees with this, some kind of criteria might exist in the idea that beyond the 5 to 10 minute walk, the more passive sorts of facilities, like distribution facilities and so on, might make sense, right? Because they would then take over serving the greater objectives of the city versus the immediate objectives of the transit station areas.
And in the case of this ordinance, what we would do is just simply not apply the TOD ordinance at that level where that presence is there. Yep.
Thank you.
I'm curious, Julie, does the city staff have a point of view when it comes to the warehouse, wholesale, or distribution part of this?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, with regard to the warehouse and the distribution and wholesaling facilities, because of the uniqueness that Eden Prairie experiences through those 5 station areas is the reason we wanted to discuss this issue specifically with you. We see that there is an opportunity to include those, as Brad talked about, maybe not right within the mixed-use district, but further out in the employment area, and that may be appropriate, but we wanted some community input on that issue as well.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to subdivision 8, which is building types. Right now in here you see photographs, and one of the things we'll probably ultimately do is swap those out with diagrams rather than photographs. We may leave them in here, and I would welcome your feedback on this as well. The reason I would swap them out is that some people can get caught up in the architectural style or the color or the landscaping or the look of what that image is, and that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is the type of building that we want to get across. But right now, for the sake of trying to illustrate it, we've just used photographs. We have a number of building types that we've defined. One is a row house, simply a row of buildings, residential in nature. But you could have offices in there too. So it's not use specific. One is courtyard. This is a building footprint where you've got a courtyard feature to it. It may be internal. It may be completely internal. We've talked about it as something where that courtyard reaches out to a public place or a street. One is stacked units. This is your typical vertical multi-story building. Comes out to the street in some cases, or maybe not. Another one is a tower, and on these you'll see that all of the ones we've showed here have some kind of what's often referred to as a pedestal. In other words, there's a base, then a step back, and then the tower portion. That's getting at kind of that pedestrian environment, pedestrian feel. So the tower is your greatest density of building. We have a commercial block. The commercial block is meant to be that basic commercial building, maybe 2-story, maybe 1-story, maybe 3-story, but there's a commercial frontage along it, the bottom floor. We have the shop front, which is your 1, maybe 2-story, purely commercial orientation. Might have a drive-through facility as part of it, might not. I think that's up to debate. Auto service, which is a building that's predominantly oriented for automobile uses. We included this one to the right here. This is in St. Paul, Lloyd's Auto Service. Only because, through design you can make those things still look more urban, look more pedestrian friendly, even though it is a predominantly auto-oriented use. The light industrial flex. All of these, you may have, tip-up panel back and the sides. It may be 1-story high ceilings, but the front around the entry is usually a 2- or 3-story with the mezzanine space and office environment, that higher finish. Parking structure. And the idea that parking structures have some kind of active use at the street level or some kind of pedestrian more pedestrian enhanced street level image. We talk about street front liner buildings. So those are the building types. And then what we've done is we said, where do those building types fit in what district? One of the places we've thought about expanding it more is requiring building types in certain environments. So right now all we've done is said in each district, let's take the mixed use district, we'll permit the row house, the courtyard, the stacked units, the tower, the commercial block, and a parking with street front liner. We don't permit the shop front, that 1-2-story, because we're wanting the most density. The auto service, we're mostly focused on pedestrian environment. The light industrial flex, or the parking structure, which is just a parking structure with nothing else attached to it. We could say, if it's the transit street, which would require a little more planning, a street that is a predominant street that connects districts right to the transit station, we could say that use requires a certain building type. Sometimes you'll see ordinances say the corner of a block requires, a certain building type because the corner is the most prominent. So that's something you can think about. We could get more explicit with this. I think right now we're choosing to be a little more flexible with the marketplace, but
The only one I noticed that I was just curious about is the fact the parking structure doesn't show up in the first category, where you're going to have taller, higher density development.
And the parking structure,
It does with the front line, with a street line.
yeah,
Right.
the way we've defined the parking structure, if you go up to I, is a standalone parking structure without any habitable space
standalone.
attached to it.
That's what I missed.
So in the
Okay.
mixed use area, parking structure we want integrated into the building. We want street level activity. We don't want that to be standalone.
Gotcha. You still get the density in parking.
Right.
You just do it in a different way.
Right.
Okay. Thank
Yep.
you.
Where would underground parking facility be classified? Would that be under standalone?
That would be something that's the fact that it's under a building or within a building, that doesn't come into play in the building type. So that could be in the tower. It could be in stacked units. It could be in courtyard. It could be in row house. Because it's underground, The predominant building type is row house, courtyard, etc. So the building form is not visible if it's underground parking.
So it's incorporated in with one of the other
Right.
subsets.
Yep, and you'll see us, I think we'll talk about that a little bit further down when we talk about parking. That's a good question.
So it looks like you're permitting everything, it's just a matter of where you're putting it. Does any commissioners have any comments about that? Is there anything that they see in there that they don't like?
I do have a quick question related to drive-throughs. I think I don't know if it was before or after the point that we've stopped in the presentation so far, but the drive-through locations or drive-up locations, you most likely see that in like a coffee shop or something, that facility. And are they going to be generally wanting a shop front type use? In which case we're not necessarily, I'm just wondering if we're limiting the mixed use right next to the TOD for things that would be quick through. You know, drive through and then you park and then you go, or you park, you drive through, you go. You know, that kind of, because it looks like it's in the employment, the TOD employment subset, and that would be that 10-minute walk or half mile, I think is what we're kind of guessing, a half-mile walk from this transit station area. I'm just wondering how that.
I guess the way I was seeing that is that the mixed use is the highest density. So, you know, most pedestrian friendly, closest to the station. So to me, the drive-through actually made sense to be that step further away from the station. And that's what I would assume the employment district is again, that step further away, lower density area. So we're concentrating, you know, the density and the various uses as close to the station as possible. I see what we're trying to do is appeal to the uniqueness of a transit station compared to what we have today, is a density of people coming in one spot into the community in one place. So how do we appeal to that group of people coming in? And to me, a drive-through is kind of separate from that whole thinking. So I see that as further away. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I think I see your point, and I would agree that, you know, you're going to drive into from outside of this TOD district. You're going to drive into, you can pick up your coffee and then, or I mean, I'm just using that as an example. You can pick up your coffee and then you can go park and then you can ride. I'm just wondering if those shops or those retail businesses that would have that opportunity of drive through, drive up, if they would want 2 sites. So you would have to they would have to invest capital in the mixed use sub-district for those that are traveling the train, and then they would have to invest because they have their corporate structure and how they design their buildings. And then they'd have to invest something else. So they'd be retooling, and I'm not sure if that would be conducive. You know, but I totally agree that, you know, we don't want to have drive-throughs in an area that we're trying to promote pedestrian friendly, right? But are we looking at the lens from only one side? I'm not sure.
I think your question raises an interesting issue I hadn't thought about until you brought it up, and the issue is there are different constituencies for these transit stations. So an example of that would be that there are going to be people coming from other towns in the metro through this area for various reasons, right? Some are coming in because they have employment here, whatever. But another constituency would be the group of people who live here and who have functional reasons or functional things to get done potentially around the stations. They might want that quick coffee or that quick something or other. And so that makes me wonder a little bit about, is that another way of looking at this beyond, and that is the different constituencies that are going to be using these trains? Because it's not going to be just folks from other towns. It's going to be a mix of different kinds of groups. And they're going to have, the implication is those different kinds of groups have different kinds of needs and drivers that cause them to spend discretionary funds, etc. I don't know if that, I was just trying to build a little bit on what you're bringing up, because you have to almost, it's not unidimensional, it's multidimensional.
I'm silent on it because it's one that's tricky and not easy. We have talked in our office, and number one, I think we have a lot more work to do on how we deal with drive-thrus. So I had a note on it before, and I said, we'll see what they say. One school of thought is that in the TODMU district, you allow it, but you allow it internal. So if you're going to have structured parking, drive-throughs incorporated into the structured parking. We see it in other places. And people, if they really want to have it, and they really want to be in that environment, they'll figure out how to incorporate that into the design. So in the language in here, I don't know where it's at, but somewhere in here it says the drive-throughs would be integrated into the design of the building.
Could be integrated into what? The side of the building?
Integrated into the building. It's on page 6.
Yeah, I don't see, I look at that as kind of like underground parking. You know, if it's designed integral into the building, into a parking structure in the building, it's okay, because it's not really impacting the area, the outside area. But I still think the thing that's unique about transit-oriented development is transit. And I think that's, in my mind, that's what I would be focusing on here is, Steve, you talk about different constituencies. I think the constituency we worry most about in these zones is the transit constituency. And the driver, the constituent who's coming in from another community to park and use transit is going to have plenty of opportunities to stop at a drive-in on the way in. You know, the person who's using transit to get to employment or to get to retail or to get to residential, I don't see I see the drive-in as being a negative to that constituency. I have trouble with that word at 8 o'clock at night.
Me too. No, I think that point is well taken, and I'm not pushing for that particular kind of
but it's a good
development. But I think within what I believe you call the transit constituency are some subgroups that are there for different reasons, that are using the equipment for different reasons, that are traveling for different reasons. And the question is, how do you get those folks excited about the areas around these transit stations based upon their differing needs without making it too complicated? It's very similar to, you know, when you do advertising or anything like that, you have certain target audiences you're trying to excite or motivate to do something. And that's kind of what we're doing here in the context of the transit constituency, I think.
The drive-in, I think, was just one example. Here's a question, probably for everybody, if they want to chime in. What would a bank be constituted under the permitted building types? What would you constitute, or what would a bank want to build that would fall within a building type? And so drive-through, drive-up ATMs or something like that, or walk-through ATMs. I guess, you know, you're going to have walk-through ATMs, right? But what would a bank be considered, like a brick and mortar? Would they most likely want to go shop front, or would they incorporate within, you know, the commercial block area? Because then the commercial block we're permitting that under the TODMU subset, but we're not permitting the shop front. And so it comes down to an architectural design difference as to what a bank would want as their design.
So maybe I can answer that. So today, when we look at our zoning code, Chapter 11 of the code, we would look at banks as either retail or office. So they could actually fall within either of those categories. So, I mean, we could do the same thing here within our transit area. I mean, if it's a bank like Wells Fargo, which has your retail services and then office component, let's say above that, and, you know, multiple stories, you know, that's something different. But if you're talking about your kind of your walk-up, you know, ATM, quick services, that may fall more within the retail category.
It's the form that is the rub. So, you know, a bank wants to come in. You look at the use table, Well, they could be neighborhood commercial. If they're a really, really big bank and they're part of a bigger commercial development, they could be community commercial. So they're permitted into the MU or the E district. Or, if they're small, under the R district. The form is where the rub comes in. Most banks want a drive-through. They want the teller. And if that's the case, well then, drive-through has to be integrated into the primary structure of the building. So I think we need to be, when I said we still need to work on that, we need to be more specific about what that means. Does that mean this picture that we have of this one right here, is that integrated into the primary structure of the building? It's an appendage to it, but if I'm an architect, I'm going to say, and I'm a banker, I'm going to say that's integrated to the building. You know, so what I think we're intending to say, and this goes back to Steve's comments earlier about the warehouse distribution uses, the form may be more, I think you used the word passive, further out. It may be, you know, some of those less pedestrian-friendly environments may be okay further out, but right at that core mixed use, what I'm hearing may be that we don't want drive-throughs.
I mean, that is what you're hearing from me, just in the sense of, to me, the multi-use is the closest to the transit station. It's the most focused on the pedestrian area. It's the most likely area where people are going to walk. And to me, that I would encourage that. And the logical progression of that thinking is that would discourage, you know, drive-throughs and things that are automotive intensive. Push those a little further out. So yeah, that's exactly what you're hearing from me. That's one opinion.
And I agree with that, and I think that what you want to encourage is people to park the car and go into the shops, as you're the closest to the transit, and you can stop and get your coffee on your way to the train. Whereas you don't want to bring people in to a unique coffee shop that's got a nice drive-through who are going to go through the drive-through and head on, to work in their cars. And that could be encouraged if the drive-through is close to the transit station.
But I think you could have and I guess with the bank piece of it, you could have ATM kiosks around or whatever that people are walking up to and kind of coming and going.
Are people opposed if we did allow it to be integrated into a parking structure in the MU district, if it's internal?
Did you say would they be opposed?
Would you be opposed to that?
I would not be opposed to that, internal to a parking structure.
Yeah. I mean, the purpose of doing that would be to enable that form, but it's not going to draw people in who say, oh, I can drive through. It's going to be people who know the district, who know it's there, who don't have a problem navigating to it. It's going to be the bank that really wants to be in the mixed-use environment close to the transit station, but also wants to have that pro forma drive-through.
So how does that typically work then when it's incorporated within the parking structure? Is it its own curb cut, or is it...
No, it shares curb cuts. That's the whole purpose of it, is to try to minimize the impact. So downtown Minneapolis, U.S. Bank on 4th Street or 5th Street, you go in like you're going to the parking ramp, and then right before you go into the ramp and pull your ticket, you peel to the right, and then you come out and you merge with the people coming out of the parking ramp. So you minimize the pedestrian impact area, which is the whole purpose of...
I think that's the key, minimizing the pedestrian impact area.
Yeah. Now, most people, it doesn't fit their model, they may just not do it.
Yeah,
but some people,
right?
Some people who really want it, and that's part of their performance, if they know that they have to follow that form, then they're going to do it. And that's the whole principle behind form-based codes. We talk about some of those. It's the idea of the design driving it, not necessarily the use.
So I also agree with this idea. I guess I would call it car-centric. I'm being silly, but as you get closer to the station, you're less car-centric. But the only question I really have around that is for the elderly and who are growing in numbers and all that sort of stuff, does the ability to get close to the station in a car make the use of the station more likely for a whole bunch of those constituents? I basically really strongly agree with this idea of not being car-centric, but I'm wondering if you make it less car-friendly closer to the stations, do you reduce access for certain parts of the population?
You do. I don't think the intention would be to make it less car friendly. I think it's more pedestrian friendly. You got to balance. You got to find the balance.
That would be the action, right? That's what would happen if we were to do that, I guess.
Okay.
Just the outcome, whether it's desired or not, I don't know, but that would be the outcome. Should we move on?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Chair. Subdivision 9, building bulk and dimension standards. This is, I mentioned a couple times the testing. We're going through this testing environment. We've established some basic bulk standards. The first three you see in there, we have, so the first column lists out what the standard is. The second column gets at what I think, Commissioner Steve, you were talking about, the area. Where do we apply it? Our methodology changed as we populated this. Originally we had quarter mile, half mile, we had 5-minute walk, 10-minute walk. But the point that you raise, and I think is an important point, is that some of these things are more important at the core than they are further away. So we're still toying with that methodology a little bit. We have lot size, lot width, and lot depth. Lot size, we don't feel it's necessary to have a minimum lot size. Most of the projects, if not all of them, are redevelopment oriented. Someone's going to come in, assemble land. The marketplace is going to drive a development of a certain size. On that same vein, I don't know that it's critical that we have lot width and lot depth in this particular environment. And when we do the testing, these things become somewhat difficult when we're working in that dense of an environment. And so we're still toying with that, but ultimately we may come back and recommend that we don't have any of those dimensions. We need to work through that with staff a little bit and share some of our testing, but that's one thing that we're grappling with. The big thing I want to point out on this, most importantly, is the building heights. This is a substantial departure from the norm, and that is that we say we have a 4-story minimum and we have no maximum. Where traditionally we say maximum building height is X. Now we're saying, you know what, the market's going to drive how high they want to build in these environments. The market and the ability of the infrastructure to handle that development. But we want to make sure that we get a certain level of density at that core area. So we have minimum stories of 4, and we have no maximum. Reactions to that? Questions about that?
So is there a number of, is there a certain amount of height that at some point in time dramatically changes the character of an area based on your experience?
It's kind of a judgment call. You guys answer that question.
I mean, if someone came and said, I'm being silly, but if someone said, let's go with a 50-story building, I would guess that would dramatically change the character of that area.
It would address the skyline.
So my only question, just for everybody to, whatever they'd like to do, to think about might be, is there some point beyond which, and I don't know the answer, you get a dramatic change in the character of the area based upon the height?
John and I were just convincing here a little bit because we remember the public hearings that we had for the Presbyterian home when we wanted to go, what was that, 11 or 12 stories, I think? 13?
Lucky 13.
That was approved, and I mean, that shook the core of some of Eden Prairie.
Yeah.
Just in the sense of that's not Eden Prairie at all, And so the having no maximum is really a little bit of a new direction. And I understand when we say no maximum, there really is a maximum there because of the infrastructure and all. And, I actually was a proponent of the Presbyterian home. I thought it was a good move for Eden Prairie. But there are a lot of people. You agree,
There was,
John?
yeah. I mean, I voted yes for it as well. I mean, when you started talking about this, Brad, I looked over at Commissioner Kirk and I said, well, wow, that makes me a little nervous. Just the fact of the no minimums, no maximums, those type of things, those make me a little skittish, I guess I can say. I don't know how the other commissioners feel. How do you feel?
Is there a correlation between the no max? I mean, will a developer find its maximization based upon the area that it's at with this new implementation of the TDM management or the implementation of the infrastructure requirements and the letter of credit that is required to be placed within whatever project design that they've got? I mean, if they've got a certain threshold at which it becomes a negative delta for them to actually go another story without being imposed upon a lot of financial burden for infrastructure improvement. I mean, I'm wondering if that is almost a litmus test for whether or not.
I think there is a maximum there. We just don't know exactly what it is.
Do we know whether
Maximum is what somebody's willing to spend. I mean, the reality is that some people will advocate and say that transit stations and light rail investments are going to bring all this new investment, and that could be true. I mean, you look at some of the urban centers, and they're building up around those things incredibly dense. If that opportunity presented itself in the right development project came and said, we want to do that, and their development project was 40 stories high, and they're far enough away from people where people aren't objecting to it, would you accept it? Would you allow it? And I think if it's the right, design, people probably would. So the question is, do you put a max, and what is that max, and how do you arrive at that max? I mean, you asked the question earlier, Travis, what was the rationale behind the density? We could come up with some rationale. What would be the rationale on limiting the height? Well, it's this capacity of infrastructure, one. It's the character, which is hard to really define because there's a lot of different judgments that lie into it. We could put a max in there, but ultimately we said, you know what? Let's not put a max in, and let's just make sure that whoever does come in to do a project knows that there's a cap on the infrastructure that needs to be defined. So if you're going to push that envelope in height, you need to expend the dollars to understand the implications on roadway, traffic, sanitary sewer, water, stormwater, infrastructure systems. Character is a harder one to judge, but
Well, I also don't know. I don't know the answer to this either, but I assume that the taller a building goes, assuming a similar base, the taller a building goes, the greater the tax return from that building, because whether it's commercial or whatever, it's higher density, so you get a greater tax return, which enables more infrastructure development, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know this subject well enough to go really beyond that, but I certainly would guess that there would be a reaction at some level of height where people would say no.
Yeah.
And I think maybe what we're doing is saying there's a sensitivity to that needs to be pretty prominent, even if we can't define it at the moment.
Well, then you deal with a group that thinks that, the city of Eden Prairie is going after the height or whatever just so that we can get more tax dollars in a tax base.
Right.
Which we have to, in my opinion, I think we have to be careful. That's not necessarily what this commission is doing, but we get accused of it.
And I think you also have to just say, time is passing. Whatever it was, Presbyterian home was what, 5-6 years ago?
Or longer.
And that was kind of shaking things. Well, we didn't, light rail wasn't realistically on the horizon then. Oh, sure, everybody was talking about it, but we weren't at the point we are now. So, the city's got to change to a point. And that's, I think, the question that Steve was bringing up is, what's that point? And I don't know that that's easy to define right now. And yet I know that personally I would be more receptive to higher structures than I would have been 6 or 8 years ago, just because of how things are evolving in the community.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, I think you and I were both on the commission when they built that building right across from the mall, and there was a lot of...
With massage.
Yeah, there was a lot of controversy about that, and it's done, and it looks great, and you don't hear anything more about it. I don't know if city staff hears anything more about it, but I think it,
Well, I don't know if there's any way to do this, but clearly there's a sensitivity somewhere.
Yeah, there's a threshold.
And the question is, as we go forward, how do we ensure that that the fact that there is that sensitivity is understood by potential developers and so on and so forth, so we're not wasting inordinate amounts of planning time, I'm being silly for a moment, on 75-story buildings.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it may, like we said in our last meeting, it may go down to the level where you really have to look at the individual proposition and say, how does that work with the sensitivities and why would we want to do this, et cetera. But the sensitivity is being pretty strongly voiced, I believe.
Yeah, and I remember specifically with Presbyterian homes, you know, there was a lot of green spaces that they incorporated in there, and fountains and nice and walkability, and it just looked like a nice project. It wasn't just a 13-story building that went straight up and that was the end of it. You know, that goes back to you, Stephen, as far as it, almost by case basis, and what do they bring to the table, and what does it look like, and how does it affect the citizens around?
And I think on the other hand, we are focusing on much higher densities than we have in the past because of the transit coming in. And with higher densities, you know, we're going to get some of that.
Yep.
Some of those questions.
Just by observation, you're seeing that happen even without transit.
Yeah.
I mean, the development project next to Buca is 6 stories, 7 stories. There's no transit there. So
Yeah.
the good news is you don't have to have an answer tonight. We are in draft form. And this dialogue right here is extremely helpful for me, and knowing that there is a sensitivity, which we knew before, but maybe we need to explore ways to articulate what that is, but not necessarily establish a cap, but at least demonstrate it.
Yeah. I mean, can you get wording in there that alludes to the sensitivity?
We can work on something, yeah.
I mean, whether it be, there could be certain criteria that regarding that sensitivity, that as long as a potential developer understood, the Planning Commission and the city would be looking at, does some building at some height meet those criteria, aesthetic, whatever they might be at that time. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a review about that. It isn't wide open.
Yeah, and I think there is a threshold, particularly related to the infrastructure stuff, where, you know, if you're only doing this level of development, you probably don't need to do a lot of detailed analysis of infrastructure impacts. But if you go above that, then you hit that threshold where we need to understand broader impacts.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so moving on, some of the other stuff. We add some floor area ratio. This again, where we look at that quarter mile versus half mile. We increase the density there. This 1.5 should actually be 2. And that's dictated not as much by us establishing an FAR, but by having, where is it at? A minimum building footprint coverage and having a 4-story minimum. We're at 2. And 2 is reasonable in that TOD area. In fact, that's kind of on the low end of where a lot of TOD experts say you want to have your densities at. Beyond that, I think you can look through some of those. They're not, I don't think any of those are really earth-shattering. I just wanted to really focus on the ones that were really a significant departure, which you had a good dialogue on. So thank you for that. So we'll take that feedback and wrap that into some further discussions that we have. You see some blank boxes. Here's where some of those testing illustrations will add in to demonstrate what that looks like. So we'll fill those in as we get further through. Subdivision 10, building orientation and design standards. Here we're really talking about primary entrance, you know, those architectural features that are most prominent and that they're facing a public realm environment. We talk about building articulation and some distances in there. You know, architectural enhancements, a lot of these are more statements that are subjective that you apply in that site plan review process. Parking standards here, you know, they become reviewed on a case-by-case basis. In theory, we're in a transit-dependent area that a lot of the people that live or work there are going to ride transit, but we can't guarantee that. So what we've wrapped into here are a reduction in parking standards, but not a significant reduction. We still need to know that if people don't use transit, there's still adequate off-street parking that can be accommodated. So we may use proof of parking. There may be some more language we add in here about district parking. So if someone comes in and wants to do less parking off-street, we need to have some kind of study to show how they can accommodate more should it evolve to that or should it be needed. And one approach would be some kind of district parking. I think we can wrap into this also the idea, if your project's a big enough project that you have to do some kind of special service district, which is a statutory process to establish a tax entity that says we're going to build this district parking and here's how it's going to be maintained. It's through all the people that live within that district. So we're going to add some more language in that kind of starts to get at some of that from a parking standard standpoint. Any comments on parking? Okay, the next section that we did a fair amount of new stuff that this is not common in a lot of ordinances is the bicycle parking. And if you have questions on this, I'll note them. This isn't my area of expertise. But we did pull some standards from TOD resources that talks about accommodating bicycle facilities on site. Again, this is trying to get at, the whole non-auto experience if you desire to do that and making sure that we've accommodated that parking area. So just like parking ratios, we have bicycle ratios. And that's what those are. Any questions on that stuff?
I think just a quick thing. If you scroll back up on letter D, it says secured. And one thing that I was thinking of when I was breezing through this was you're having them secured, anchored to the ground, but we're using bikes predominantly, especially if they're outdoor during the biking season. And so what about the winter maintenance requirements on securing something physically to the ground all times? I don't know if there should be language that could be added in there that would secure to the ground while in use. We do have other language that has certain indoor bicycle parking opportunities and long-term storage opportunities, but when you have these bike racks, and I'm just thinking of the ride share, they pull them at a certain date. I don't know what that is.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if we want to have all that in the way when plows are going through and curb,
You're saying secure them to the ground for 6 months and then get rid of them during the winter time.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be able to look into that ride share program to see what day it is. Do they have a test for the weather, if it's certain temperature at a certain time, or if they've got a demand schedule and then they say, okay, it's hit that threshold, we're going to pull them in a week or something like that.
One minor question I had was, what do we do with motorcycles in this context? Only because the household penetration on motorcycles is reasonable. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's reasonable. Do we do anything about motorcycles, or would it be perfectly, or do we provide facilities, or is it completely the opposite, that we pretty much restrict the access of motorcycles or motorized single-person two-wheel vehicles, which are now becoming three-wheel vehicles in a lot of cases, to the area?
So today in our code, we don't give credit, or we don't have a specific provision that talks about motorcycle parking or like scooter parking. So that is something that we could look at incorporating into this ordinance, or in our ordinance as a whole.
Only if you think it is needed. I just wonder, because it seems like there's a fair amount of transportation that goes on that kind of vehicle, and the three-wheelers, which I know nothing about really, I just see more advertising for and so on.
I think you bring up a very valid point. The conventional sense of motorcycle is something that would be 600 cc's and above, but I think we're seeing, in fact, I'm seeing just walking around Eden Prairie, more uses of motorized bikes. Now, is that considered motorcycle by the definition of state statutes because it's over a certain cc's and over a certain diameter of wheel, or I'm not sure, but I think I'm seeing more and more of those by various age groups and demographics around town.
I think it varies by state to state as well. There's some vehicles that are three-wheel vehicles that some will say, as you read the brochures, that you need a motorcycle license in certain states in order to drive it. So I think it comes up with, it can get a little dicey, to your point, with these motorcycles.
It's kind of and I really know very little about it, but I see a lot of advertising for it and so on. It's kind of the whole area between the automobile, which is in some cases also getting smaller, and the bicycle. There's a bunch of transportation stuff going on there, even single individual transportation stuff, that by the time we would be implementing some of these things, well, I think it's a factor now, but it may be a factor that's changing over time, and I just wonder if that needs a little bit of attention somewhere in here. I don't know.
Well, we're trying to make a more bicycle-friendly area, right? And people will probably find a way to bike, or the business community will find a way to bike more efficiently and less exhausting. So we might want to think about that, right?
An example would be, do you make it I'm just saying this, let's say we talk about Harleys. Do you make it a motorcycle-friendly environment, or is it a less friendly environment? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but.
That's a good point. We'll take a look at it. A lot of things that you just said triggered a bunch of other thoughts about alternative vehicles in general. So
And hybrids and whatnot.
car sharing, the zip car, who knows, that kind of stuff.
So,
Okay.
landscape?
That takes us to the last section. A lot of what we're talking about here is incorporating other requirements that are in the existing code and elsewhere. But we did add a little bit that I think we need to do a better job of articulating how we measure it, and that is the ability, because we're in an urban environment, to accommodate other site amenities, whether it's public art or interpretation or other things, in swapping out, kind of bargaining for some of the landscaping standards, figuring out a way to allow that, still getting an amenity, but whether it's a landscape versus a hardscape amenity. We did add section C, this open space standards. The idea is that you present a percentage of the area as open space, and that open space can be one of a number of different configurations, which open space forms or how we've laid that out. And whether it's a park that you might have, like in the residential area, a green, which might be more of a natural passive area, a square, which might be more closer in proximate to the transit station, a plaza, which is a small hard surface area, or a playground, which could be integrated in just about anywhere. These percentages that you see here, which 7% was meant to be 5%, not 7%. It's a duplicate. There's another line up in the previous bulk standards table that laid that out. But those numbers were based on running some quick calcs and tests again. If we look at a typical block, how much area does that mean? 5%. And that then is put to that as a plaza area where you might have enough area where people could have a few tables, the human chessboard kind of things, the different things that are interactive, and it's meant to be active open space. So that was kind of you can think about that as park dedication for the TOD district almost, but it could be private. Most likely it's going to be a private space, a private public open space.
I got a quick question on that, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
With the percentages, and I was just looking back at the definitions, and the K, usable outdoor open space definition, has a minimum of 2,000 contiguous square feet, and I think the discussion was, do we want to have a lot minimum, lot maximum? Well, if we put a percentage on the outdoor usable open space and define it as a specific minimum earlier on, we almost are putting ourselves or cornering ourselves in having to create a lot minimum, lot maximum.
No,
and then what do you define as lot?
Yep.
And then do you do this on a per lot basis because each individual retailer could be that lot versus the whole lot of development, which would accompany multiple retailers or multiple tenants, and what would each of them have to have their separate open space, or are we aggregating it? I think this is
I think we aggregate it. I think you look at this the same way you do park dedication almost. That what I don't know is what's the mechanism, and staff asked this question, and we got to talk about it because I don't know exactly how you make it work. We need to look into that. But if you think about that open space, we've talked about in the purpose statement, we want it closest to the transit station. So does that mean someone who's a block away has to provide that 10% open space? Maybe there's a better contribution to that open space amenity level near the station. So we need to explore that. That's a good point, a good observation. And I think there's some conflicting data in there. Any other questions on it? Otherwise, these are good points. If there's others that you come across as you're thinking about this, certainly email staff and they can get those to us. As it's 8:21, the last thing I wanted to just mention, kind of next steps, we're going to reevaluate the elements and incorporate revisions based on the feedback we've had today, and continue to test some of these things and draw some illustrations to help present those. Staff is going to work up a strategy. We're going to do a little bit of stakeholder outreach and present this to some of the development community, the business community, through some of your existing structures for that. And once we get through some of that feedback, then we'll bring the next draft back to you in the fall following that outreach. The objective, again, as Julie laid out in the beginning, is we want to have a draft document pretty well buttoned up. It doesn't have to necessarily have gone through all the approval processes, but our work is largely done by the end of the year on it. So.
Does staff project that next draft presentation to be part of the planner's report, or is that going to be an open meeting? Or do they have not figured out?
To be determined. I think it'll depend on, what projects we have in line, as we get closer to the fall, if we have, public hearings, if this is something that ultimately we bring back as maybe a workshop, just with the Planning Commission, that's yet to be determined.
Brad, was this helpful to you? Did you get the things that you needed from us tonight?
I'm sorry?
I said, was this helpful to you? Did you get everything that you needed out of the commissioners?
Yes. No, this was a very helpful discussion and very directive. I appreciate the feedback.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it looks like very nice quality work.
Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Regina or Julie, any closing comments in regard to the TOD discussion tonight?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we appreciate the time that you've spent on it this evening. You've given us a lot of insight, and as Regina stated, we haven't finalized yet timelines and forms that it'll come back, but it will be back before you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Julie, are there any other planners' reports for tonight?
Mr. Chair, no.
Okay. Commissioners, thank you. It was a good discussion. I appreciate it. Any members' reports for tonight? Any continuing business? Any new business? If not, I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Motion second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting is closed.